Right now, somewhere beneath a quiet Canadian city, the ground is hollow. Not in the way that ground is always hollow, honeycombed with roots and worm channels and the slow shifting of old rock. This is a different kind of hollow, deliberate, shaped, the kind that takes human hands to make. If you were small enough to slip through certain walls in certain basements in certain parts of Saskatchewan or British Columbia or Nova Scotia, you would find yourself in passages that no official city map has ever fully charted. The air down there is cooler than the street above. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The walls, depending on where you are, might be rough-cut timber, cribbing gone dark and soft with age, or brick laid in patterns that don't match anything built above ground, or something older still, something that draws the eye and resists easy explanation. Somewhere in the darkness ahead of you, a draft moves, which means these passages connect to something, which means they go somewhere. Where exactly is a question that historians have been arguing about for over 100 years, and in some cases are still no closer to answering. That is the mystery we are going to follow tonight, slowly, the way you would follow a tunnel with only a candle. Here is what makes it so strange. The evidence was never hidden in the way that conspiracies require things to be hidden. There were no powerful institutions suppressing the tunnels, no grand cover-up requiring perpetual maintenance. The tunnels were hiding in something more ordinary and more total than secrecy. They were hiding in the assumption that they could not possibly be significant, in the assumption that Canada, being young and sparsely settled and built on a grid of pragmatic Victorian streets, simply did not have the kind of underground past that warranted serious attention. For a very long time, when fragments of underground passages were found beneath Canadian towns, the explanations offered were functional and immediate. Utility tunnels, old drainage channels, steam pipe routes, bootleggers' bolt holes perhaps, or the improvised shelters of people who had nowhere else to go. These explanations were not always wrong. Sometimes they were exactly right, but the habit of reaching for them, the reflex toward the simple and the already understood, very meant that other questions were never asked. Who built these? How old are they actually? What do the sections that don't match the known utility records represent? Why do certain passages run in directions that make no engineering sense for the purposes they were supposed to serve? Why do some of them predate the buildings above them by margins that are deeply uncomfortable to contemplate? Those questions have been accumulating for a century, and the people who have tried hardest to answer them, the archaeologists, the urban historians, the geologists, the indigenous knowledge holders who have been pointing at certain underground spaces and saying something very different about them for generations, are still not in agreement. What they have found, collectively, and often in the gaps between their disagreements, is a picture of the underground that is stranger and richer and more layered than the official story ever suggested. We are going to move through that picture slowly tonight. We will go beneath Moose Jaw and find a world that the history books still cannot fully account for. We will follow the tunnels of Victoria and understand something about how persecution creates its own architecture. We will go underground with the people who built the tunnels, who hid in them, who were erased from the surface and found ways to continue existing beneath it. We will descend into the Cold War and find that the government's own relationship with the underground was considerably more extensive and considerably less documented than most Canadians have ever been told. And we will sit with the genuinely unexplained, not the supernatural or the conspiratorial, but the real and documented anomalies that have resisted every neat answer offered so far. If you're using this to fall asleep, that is exactly what it was made for. The tunnels will still be there when you wake up. Nothing below requires urgency. Settle in. Let the darkness be comfortable for once, and if you feel like it, before you drift, leave a comment. Tell me where you are and what time it is there. It is always someone in a cold city at the wrong end of a long week, and someone else somewhere warmer who found their way here by accident. That is its own small mystery. Now, let us go underground. Here's the thing about official histories. They are not usually written by liars. They are written by people with limited tools, standing in limited places, looking at evidence they did not yet have the framework to understand, and drawing conclusions that felt responsible at the time. Then those conclusions get repeated, and the repetitions get cited in papers, and eventually they stop feeling like conclusions at all. They feel like facts. They feel like things that have always been known. The myth of Canada's empty underground is one of those. For most of the last century and a half, the dominant assumption in historical research, in urban archaeology, and in popular understanding was that the ground beneath Canadian cities was essentially uninteresting before the cities themselves arrived. Canada was young. European settlement was recent. The colonial towns of the 18th and 19th centuries were built on what planners described as empty land that had no prior urbanism, no layered history of construction and demolition and rebuilding, nothing like the underground complexity you might find in Rome or London or Istanbul, where cities had been stacked on cities for thousands of years. You put down a grid of streets, you built your buildings along it, and what was underneath was simply earth, maybe some pipes, eventually some utility tunnels when the pipes got complicated. Nothing more. This assumption felt logical on its face, and for a particular kind of European-descended settler city, it was not entirely wrong. A town founded in 1870 and still functioning in 1920 simply had not been accumulating underground history for very long. The layers were shallow. The anomalies were few. But this framework had a problem that no one addressed very carefully, because addressing it would have required asking uncomfortable questions. It assumed that the only histories that mattered underground were the ones that matched the official history above ground. The documented histories, the colonial histories, the histories of mayors and land grants and water main installation schedules. Anything that didn't fit into those records was either dismissed or folded into a category of informal use, something temporary and marginal and not worth the serious attention of official scholarship. The people most likely to have created something significant underground in the period between European contact and the full establishment of colonial urban infrastructure were precisely the people whose histories were least likely to be documented in official records, and indigenous nations whose relationship with the land, including the underground, stretched back thousands of years. Chinese laborers whose existence the Canadian government worked actively to erase from civic life. Black communities who had come north through the Underground Railroad and found that even freedom came with walls. Métis people navigating a world that was trying to extinguish their identity while simultaneously depending on their knowledge of the land. These were not the people writing the administrative records that later historians would search. Their underground was not going to show up in a waterworks ledger. And here is where a second layer of the problem emerges, what we might call the observer problem. The people who studied Canadian urban history in the first serious wave of the 20th century were almost entirely working from documents, papers, land records, municipal contracts, newspaper archives. Physical archaeology, the actual digging and mapping and material analysis of what was in the ground, was applied to urban Canadian sites only sporadically, and usually only when construction projects accidentally exposed something that had to be dealt with quickly. The underground was not a priority. It was not a subject. It was an absence where no subject had been thought to exist. When anomalies did appear, and they appeared regularly, enough that they should have prompted sustained inquiry. They were handled individually and in isolation. A tunnel found under a building being renovated in Moose Jaw in the 1980s was explained as a legacy of steam heating infrastructure. A series of interconnected rooms found beneath Victoria's Chinatown was catalogued as informal storage used by Chinese merchants. Passages found under Halifax buildings were attributed to the military fortifications that everyone knew existed. Each explanation had a plausible ring to it. Each one might even have been partly correct, but none of them led to the next question, which is why these spaces were so much more extensive than the official record suggested, why some of them showed signs of habitation rather than simply of utility, and why certain sections of tunnel turned in directions that made no obvious practical sense. The habit of not asking those questions had a name, though no one used it at the time. It was a shifting baseline, the same cognitive error that made people look at the post-epidemic Amazon and see a wilderness that had always been empty. Each generation of researchers looked at the underground of Canadian cities as it appeared to them in the available records, treated that appearance as the natural state of things, and stopped there. The people and the purposes that had been there before the records, or between the records, or underneath the records, remained invisible. That invisibility was not accidental in every case. Some of it was the ordinary blindness of incomplete documentation, but some of it was the active result of policies and powers that had very deliberate reasons to keep certain populations underground, both literally and figuratively, and to ensure that what happened there would not be entered into the ledgers that future historians would consult. To understand what was actually under the ground, you first have to understand what was being done to keep certain people out of sight above it, and that means going to a small city on the Saskatchewan plains in the years just after the railway was built, when a question that Canada had not yet decided how to answer was pressing against every door and every basement wall in Chinatowns from Vancouver to the edges of the prairie. There is a particular quality to the light in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, in the early morning. The prairie sky is enormous in a way that becomes physically apparent only when you stand in it, the kind of enormous that makes the town below feel very small and very exposed. Everything is visible from a great distance. There is almost nowhere to hide above ground, which makes what is underneath all the more striking. Moose Jaw sits roughly 80 kilometers west of Regina, near the junction of the Moose Jaw River and Thunder Creek, at a spot where Cree and Assiniboine peoples had camped and traded for centuries before the Canadian Pacific Railway arrived in 1882 and transformed a prairie river, crossing into a division point. The railroad made Moose Jaw. It brought workers, then settlers, then merchants, then the full apparatus of a small colonial city. By the turn of the century, Moose Jaw had banks and hotels and churches and a Chinatown, and beneath the streets of that Chinatown, it had something that the city's official history could not fully account for. The tunnels of Moose Jaw are real. This is the starting point, and it is important to state it clearly before everything else, because the tunnels have attracted enough legend and embellishment over the years that the reality sometimes gets lost in the retelling. Beneath several blocks of downtown Moose Jaw, there exists a series of interconnected underground passages and rooms, some of them substantial enough to stand upright in, some of them narrower and lower, connecting through brick and timber frameworks that were modified repeatedly over decades. They are not a rumor. They are not a metaphor. You can, if you purchase a ticket from the tunnels of Moose Jaw, tourism attraction that has operated there since the early 1990s, walk through a portion of them yourself. What you cannot do, and this is where the history becomes genuinely contested, are to agree on what you're looking at when you do. Two stories, both dramatic, both involving figures larger than local history usually accommodates, are told about these tunnels. The first involves Chinese workers. The second involves Al Capone. Both have passionate defenders. Both have equally passionate detractors. And the fascinating and somewhat unsatisfying truth is that the archaeology beneath Moose Jaw does not yet fully support or fully disprove either of them. Let us start with the Chinese story because it is older and because it connects to something real and devastating that was happening above ground at exactly the right time. By 1885, the Canadian Pacific Railway was complete. The Golden Spike had been driven. The coast-to-coast line that would bind the country together was finished. And the thousands of Chinese workers who had done some of the most dangerous and punishing labor involved in building it, the workers who had been paid 60 to 70 cents a day compared to the dollar or more earned by their white counterparts, the workers who had died in numbers that were never precisely recorded, but that historians now estimate at hundreds just in the Fraser Canyon alone, those workers were suddenly not needed anymore. The Canadian government's response to their continued presence was the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, which imposed a $50 head tax on every Chinese person entering Canada. $50 was roughly 2 months' wages for a laborer at the time. Within 15 years, it would be raised to $100. Within 18 years, to $500, a sum that could take years to save. The intent was not subtle. The intent was to make continued Chinese immigration economically impossible while retaining the option to import Chinese labor again if it became convenient, and to make the lives of those Chinese people already in Canada difficult enough that they might leave. They did not leave, or most of them did not. They stayed and built communities in the margins available to them, in tight Chinatown districts in Vancouver and Victoria, and yes, in smaller cities like Moose Jaw, where the railway's administrative presence had drawn a Chinese community that by the late 1880s included laundries, small restaurants, and the networks of mutual aid that made survival possible when the surface world was systematically hostile. The question at the center of the Moose Jaw Tunnel story is whether some of those Chinese residents, if facing racist violence, police harassment, and the kind of economic exclusion that expressed itself in laws explicitly designed to push them out of sight, built or adapted a series of underground passages beneath the Chinatown district as a way to move through the city without being visible, to conduct business, to shelter people being hunted by police or vigilantes, or simply to live in a space where the surface rules did not apply. The people making this argument point to several kinds of evidence. There are sections of the tunnel system beneath what was the Chinatown district that show signs of habitation rather than mere utility. Not just passages, but rooms. Spaces with evidence of cooking fires, of bedding areas, of the kind of accumulated human presence that does not come from storing coal or roading steam pipes. On some of the artifacts recovered from these spaces in the limited archaeological work that has been done, pieces of ceramic, buttons, remnants of cloth, are consistent with a Chinese community presence in the late 19th century. There is also the question of the passages themselves, a straightforward utility. Tunnel system built to carry steam heat or to allow maintenance workers access to pipes follows certain logical rules of engineering. It goes where the pipes go. It is sized for workers to move through efficiently. It does not branch unnecessarily. Some sections of the Moose Jaw underground follow these rules, but other sections do not. There are rooms that a steam heat maintenance system has no use for. There are branches that connect spaces with no obvious functional relationship. There are modifications, brickwork laid over earlier brickwork, openings blocked up and then unblocked, and then sealed again. That suggests a space being adapted over time by people with changing needs, not simply maintained. The people arguing against the Chinese habitation story point to the lack of documentary corroboration. No letter, no diary, no official record, no report from the period explicitly describes Chinese residents living or hiding underground in Moose Jaw. The absence of documentation is not proof of absence, especially when the community most likely to have created such documentation had every reason to be careful about what it committed to paper, but it is a gap that serious historians are obligated to acknowledge. There is also a timing problem that scholars who have studied the physical structure of the tunnels most carefully have raised. The sections of tunnel that appear most clearly associated with the steam heat utility system can be dated with reasonable confidence to the early 1900s, which is consistent with the city's documented infrastructure development of that period. The sections that show possible signs of earlier or different use are harder to date precisely. The archaeological work done on the site has been limited. The tourism operation that occupies the space has not been designed with full archaeological rigor in mind, and some of the most interesting sections have been modified or partially reconstructed for visitors in ways that complicate interpretation. What this means, honestly, is that the question is not settled. The tunnels existed. Chinese residents of Moose Jaw experienced severe persecution during exactly the period in question. The physical evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The documentary evidence is absent, but perhaps deliberately so. Historians who specialize in Chinese Canadian history take the core story seriously. Historians focused on physical evidence of the built environment are more cautious. The answer, if it comes, will require more sustained archaeological investigation than the tunnels have received so far. Then there is Al Capone. Capone's alleged connection to the Moose Jaw tunnels arrived in the popular imagination somewhat later than the Chinese story, and it has a quality of legend that is even harder to disentangle from the available evidence. The basic claim is that during the Prohibition era of the 1920s, Capone or his organization used the Moose Jaw tunnels as part of a bootlegging operation, either as a place to store Canadian liquor before it moved south across the border into the United States, or as a personal refuge for Capone himself when things became difficult in Chicago. Canada's relationship with Prohibition was complicated. Some provinces went dry at various points in the 1920s, but the federal government never imposed national prohibition, and Canadian distilleries, officially producing spirits for export, continued operating throughout the American dry years. The result was a porous and profitable border trade that made southern Saskatchewan and Manitoba significant corridors for liquor moving into the United States. Bootleggers operated networks through these provinces with varying degrees of organization and sophistication. There were also, in Moose Jaw, undocumented connections to organized crime from this period. The city had a reputation for a certain permissiveness toward vice operations, not unique in the era, but significant enough to attract attention. Local politicians and police officers were later found to have taken payments to look the other way at gambling and liquor operations. Whether those operations extended into the tunnel system is not documented. The Capone claim, specifically, rests almost entirely on oral tradition, on stories passed down within certain Moose Jaw families about visitors who arrived discreetly and stayed in the underground rooms, and on the timing, which at least makes sense. Capone's organization was actively exploiting Canadian liquor supplies throughout the 1920s. He had business connections in cities along the American-Canadian border. He did, at times, need to be somewhere other than Chicago when things were complicated. But there is no documentary evidence that Capone personally was ever in Moose Jaw. His known movements during the 1920s, reconstructed by biographers and law enforcement historians, don't create an obvious gap where a Saskatchewan sojourn would fit. The FBI files from the period, which have been extensively studied, contain no Moose Jaw reference. This doesn't mean he was never there. Absence from the record is exactly what successful criminals aim for, but it means the claim rests on a foundation that history, as a discipline, cannot confirm. What makes the Moose Jaw tunnels important is not whether both stories are true, or whether either of them is true in every detail. What makes them important is what they reveal about how societies create and use hidden spaces, and how those spaces resist incorporation into official memory. Something was happening beneath Moose Jaw in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the documentary record does not fully capture. The physical evidence, however incompletely investigated, suggests a subterranean world that was more complex and more purposeful than a utility tunnel system explains. The two dramatic legends that have accumulated around it may be wrong in their details and still be right in their essential claim that people who were excluded from the legitimate surface of the city created something significant beneath it. That is a pattern that appears in different forms in underground spaces all across the country. And to understand why, you have to understand the mechanisms of that exclusion. You have to go back to the years just after the last railway spike and sit with what it actually meant to be Chinese in Canada in the 1880s, and to understand what the underground represented for the people who were being pushed toward it. When a society systematically excludes a group of people from its visible life, it does not simply create absence. It creates an alternative geography, a set of spaces and routes and practices that allow excluded people to persist in a world that has decided they should not be there, or should not be visible, or should not have access to the same surface on which everyone else moves freely. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal architectural and spatial reality, and Canada's treatment of its Chinese population in the decades surrounding the turn of the last century produced it in forms that can still be found in fragments and echoes beneath the streets of several Canadian cities. To understand the underground, you have to understand what the surface looked like from below. The Chinese workers who built the most difficult sections of the Canadian Pacific Railway came primarily from Guangdong Province in southern China, most of them through routes that passed through San Francisco and Victoria. They were recruited specifically because they would accept wages below what white workers would tolerate, because they were willing to do the most dangerous work, the work of blasting and tunneling through the mountains of British Columbia, where the cost in lives was highest, and because, crucially, they had no political standing that would allow them to organize effectively against those conditions. When a section of mountain required a man to be lowered over a cliff face in a basket to place dynamite charges that he would have to light and then hope he could be hauled up before the explosion, the man in the basket was Chinese. After 1885, those same men, and the families some of them had managed to bring over before the head tax made it prohibitively expensive, were left in a Canada that had extracted their labor and now wanted their absence. The $50 head tax was the first mechanism. The $100 tax imposed in 1900 was the second. The $500 tax of 1903, at a time when a laborer might earn $15 a month, was designed to be impossible. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923, which replaced all previous legislation and simply prohibited almost all Chinese immigration entirely, was the final statement of policy. Between 1923 and 1947, when the act was repealed, only a handful of Chinese immigrants were legally admitted to Canada. But the people already there remained, and their daily lives were conducted within a set of constraints that shaped their use of space in ways that the surface city never recorded. Anti-Chinese riots were not rare in Canada's early history. Vancouver saw significant violence in 1887 and again in 1907. Victoria had recurring episodes of harassment that sometimes escalated to property destruction. Smaller towns, including Moose Jaw, had incidents of organized violence against their Chinese communities. In this environment, the ability to move between buildings, to conduct business, or to exist in the city without being visible on the street was not a luxury. It was a practical necessity. Add to this the economic landscape. Chinese residents were legally excluded from many professions in various provinces. They could not vote in provincial or federal elections. They could not hire white women to work in their establishments. Under legislation passed in several provinces specifically to prevent Chinese-owned businesses from employing white workers. They operated laundries, restaurants, and market gardens in the narrow economic margin that remained, and they conducted much of their commerce, their social life, and their mutual aid in spaces that were not visible from the street. The basement and underground spaces of Chinatowns across Canada served multiple functions that the above-ground reality had made necessary. Storage was part of it, certainly, but storage alone does not explain rooms with evidence of cooking fires, sleeping spaces, and the accumulated material of daily habitation. It does not explain the connecting passages between buildings that allowed movement without appearing on the street. It does not explain the observation points, small openings in walls or ceilings, that allowed people in underground rooms to monitor activity on the surface without being seen. Victoria's Chinatown provides some of the clearest physical evidence of this alternative geography, and we will go there in a later section of this story. But it is worth establishing here, in the prairie context, that what appears to have existed beneath Moose Jaw was not unique to Moose Jaw, and it was part of a pattern of underground spatial adaptation that repeated itself across the country wherever Chinese communities found themselves subject to the same combination of legal exclusion, economic restriction, and physical threat. The opium dimension adds another layer. Opium was legal in Canada until 1908, and before that date, Chinese-owned opium businesses operated openly in some cities and less openly in others. They operated primarily in basement and semi-underground spaces, partly because the rents were lower, partly because the clientele included white users who preferred not to be seen entering a Chinese establishment, and partly because the semi-underground location provided a practical degree of privacy that an above-street storefront would not. After 1908, when opium was criminalized, those same spaces became illegal operations, and their existing semi-hidden character became a practical advantage. None of this was documented in any ledger that a city archivist would later file under a useful heading. The people operating these spaces had every reason to keep their existence out of the official record. The authorities occasionally raided them, which produced some documentation, but the documentation was created from the outside and was designed to criminalize rather than to understand. What the physical evidence, carefully read, suggests is a subterranean civic life of considerable sophistication, a city beneath the city, constructed entirely by people whom the official city had decided did not deserve full citizenship. It was not built in a day, and it was not built without knowledge of how spaces work underground. Some of the Chinese laborers who came to Canada had experience with mining, with tunneling, with the practical realities of working and sometimes living below ground level. The railway work itself had involved underground work. The men who dug the tunnels through the Selkirk Mountains understood rock and soil and how passages behave under weight. When they turned those skills toward creating livable, underground spaces in the cities where they eventually settled, They were applying knowledge that had been acquired at enormous human cost. The tragedy is that so much of what they built and how they lived has been interpreted through lenses that were designed to minimize it. What was described in contemporary newspaper accounts as squalid dens was in many cases a sophisticated spatial adaptation to impossible conditions. What the tourist trade later reduced to dramatic stories about Al Capone was often something quieter and more profound. The architecture of survival built by people who had been excluded from the surface by legal force, and who responded by creating their own underground civic life. That underground life, and the physical spaces it produced, is still being recovered. The archaeology is incomplete. The documentation is sparse by design. The oral histories, where they survive, are fragmentary. But the tunnels themselves, in Moose Jaw and in cities where the evidence is somewhat clearer, still exist in enough form to ask serious questions about what happened in them and who should be credited with building them. The answer that is emerging, slowly and incompletely, is that the underground history of Canada belongs primarily to the people whom the above-ground history tried hardest to erase. That is not a comfortable conclusion for official memory to absorb, but it is what the physical evidence, taken seriously, points toward. And it points in another direction too, one that official history has been even slower to acknowledge, because the Chinese communities of the late 19th century were not the first people in Canada who understood the underground differently from the colonizers who arrived to catalog it. The land had other keepers long before the railway, and some of those keepers had their own relationship with what was beneath it, that goes back much further than any tunnel a steam pipe engineer or a railway laborer ever dug. Before any railway, before any Chinatown, before any colonial city laid its grid over the Canadian prairie or the West Coast rainforest or the rocky eastern shorelines, the land was known. Not known in the way a map knows a place, with coordinates and elevation lines and property designations. Known in the way a language knows a place, which is to say completely and structurally, in the sense that the knowledge is inseparable from the way you understand everything else. That knowledge included the underground. This is where the official history of Canada's mysterious tunnels becomes most difficult to tell responsibly, because it enters a space where the evidence is of kinds that the conventional historical record was never designed to accommodate. The oral traditions of indigenous nations across Canada contain references to underground spaces that are numerous, specific in ways that are difficult to explain as pure metaphor, and in some cases corroborated by physical archaeology. They have also been systematically ignored by the historical scholarship that shaped the popular understanding of what is and is not old beneath the Canadian ground. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose territories historically encompassed what is now southern Ontario and Quebec, carry traditions about underground passages connecting significant sites in their landscape. These traditions are not the province of esoteric or marginal tellers. They are embedded in core cultural narratives about how people moved through the land, how sacred sites were connected, how certain kinds of knowledge were protected by being conducted. Underground, away from the surface world where it could be observed and interfered with. The Blackfoot peoples of the northern Great Plains, whose territories covered much of what is now Alberta and Saskatchewan, have traditions that describe underground spaces as significant in ways that archaeology has only begun to take seriously. Some of these traditions specifically describe passages that are not natural cave formations, but shaped spaces, intentional underground constructions associated with particular ceremonial and social purposes. The Anishinaabe nations, whose traditional territories stretch across the Great Lakes region and into the boreal forest, have oral traditions about underground beings and underground spaces that some scholars have begun to read not only as spiritual narrative, but as encoded geographic memory. Places where people went underground, places that were connected through passages to other places, places that required knowledge to find and knowledge to use safely. The difficulty, and it is a real and serious difficulty, is that these traditions were transmitted in contexts that the colonial project actively worked to destroy. Residential schools removed children from their communities for decades and forbade the transmission of traditional knowledge. The outlawing of ceremonies like the potlatch and the sun dance, which were suppressed under Canadian law from 1885 to 1951, interrupted the formal context in which certain kinds of geographic and historical knowledge were transmitted. Languages were suppressed, and with them the specific terms and concepts that would have allowed the most precise oral transmission of spatial and historical information. What survived in fragments and in private. And when those fragments surfaced in conversation with non-indigenous scholars, they were frequently categorized as mythology rather than history, an analytical move that told the scholar more about their own assumptions than about the traditions they were hearing. The physical record is more tractable, though not as much more as you might hope. Archaeological work at sites of historical indigenous occupation across Canada has documented underground construction of various kinds. Pit houses, semi-subterranean dwellings built with the floor set below the ground surface and a roof structure raised above it, were the primary residential form for many peoples in the interior of British Columbia. The Keatley Creek site in the Fraser Canyon, occupied for roughly 2,000 years beginning around 2,000 years ago, has contained pit houses of substantial size, some of them over 20 meters in diameter, capable of housing extended family groups of 10 to 20 people or more. At the height of its occupation, Keatley Creek may have been home to more than 1,000 people, living primarily in semi-subterranean structures. These are not caves. They are engineered underground living spaces, built by people who understood how to work with earth and timber to create warm, stable, protected environments in a landscape with significant winter temperature extremes. The knowledge required to build them was sophisticated and cumulative, transmitted across generations and representing a relationship with the underground that was fundamentally architectural rather than simply exploitative. Underground storage was practiced across virtually every indigenous culture in Canada in forms that varied from simple root cellars to elaborate constructed chambers designed to maintain specific temperature and humidity conditions for preserving particular kinds of food. Some of these storage systems were remarkably sophisticated, using soil thermal properties to maintain near constant underground temperatures regardless of surface conditions. The knowledge of how to engineer these conditions, where to dig, how deep, how to ventilate, how to seal against moisture, was specialized and valuable. There are also the caves. Canada contains thousands of caves, concentrated particularly in British Columbia, Alberta, and parts of Ontario and Quebec, where appropriate geology exists. Many of these caves show evidence of indigenous use that stretches back thousands of years. Some were used for shelter, particularly in winter or during travel. Others serve ceremonial purposes, as spaces where the boundary between the surface world and something else. The specifics vary by culture, but the basic concept of underground spaces as threshold spaces appears widely, was thinner or more permeable. Still, others were used for pictographic art, with paintings and petroglyphs found deep inside cave systems, in locations that required sustained effort and light sources to reach. In southern British Columbia, the Horn Lake Caves on Vancouver Island contain archaeological evidence of human occupation going back at least 2,500 years. The Nakamu Caves in Glacier National Park, which were not formally discovered by non-indigenous people, until 1904, had been known to Sequepemu people for considerably longer. The specific knowledge those peoples carried about the caves, how to navigate them, what they contained, what they were for, was not transferred intact to the scientists who later mapped and studied them. This is the recurring structure of the problem. Indigenous peoples knew things about the underground landscape of Canada that took non-Indigenous researchers decades or centuries to rediscover, if they rediscovered them at all. The knowledge transmission was broken, often deliberately, and the physical archaeology that might reconstruct some of that knowledge is still in its early stages in most parts of the country. And what makes this relevant to the question of Canada's mysterious tunnels is not the suggestion that Indigenous peoples built a secret tunnel network beneath the prairie cities. That particular claim belongs to the most irresponsible fringe of tunnel speculation and should be set aside. What is relevant is something more foundational, the idea that there is a deep underground history beneath the Canadian landscape, that the ground has been worked and known and used in purposeful ways going back long before colonial settlement, is not a romantic fantasy or a conspiracy theory. It is a documented archaeological fact that the official historical imagination has been consistently slow to absorb. When a researcher goes looking for anomalies in the underground of a Canadian city or landscape and finds something that does not fit the available explanations are rarely as comprehensive as they appear. They cover the well-documented colonial period imperfectly. They cover the pre-colonial period almost not at all, and they are built on an assumption about who was here and what they were doing that the growing body of Indigenous-centered archaeology is steadily and sometimes dramatically complicating. The Secwepemc elder who could describe the geography of the Nakamu caves before the first non-Indigenous person entered them knew something real. The Blackfoot oral tradition that describes underground passages in the Alberta foothills is describing something. Whether that something is a literal constructed passage, a natural geological feature known through deep familiarity, or a spatial reality that does not map onto either of those categories, is a question that will require sustained collaboration between Indigenous knowledge holders and physical scientists to approach. Honestly, that collaboration is beginning. It is not moving quickly. The damage done by a century and a half of colonial scholarship that treated Indigenous knowledge as mythology is not reversed in a generation. But the conversations are happening, and in some cases they are producing discoveries that the conventional tools of archaeology would not have found on their own. In the meantime, anyone who wants to understand what is truly mysterious about the tunnels beneath Canada has to start by taking seriously a knowledge tradition about the underground that predates every building, every railway, and every official map by a minimum of thousands of years. Go west from the prairie and the underground changes character. In British Columbia, the surface is more dramatic, mountains and fjords and ancient rainforest, and the underground that was built within its cities reflects a different history, one that shares the themes of exclusion and survival but plays them out in a landscape and a commercial context that gave the hidden spaces particular functions. Victoria, on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, was in the second half of the 19th century one of the most significant Chinese communities in Canada and one of the most cosmopolitan cities on the Pacific coast. It was a trading hub, a transit point for goods moving between Asia and the interior, and a city that, despite or perhaps because of its official British character, harbored a remarkable variety of underground economies and spaces. The physical core of Victoria's underground history is the Chinatown district, specifically the area around Fan Tan Alley, which holds the distinction of being the narrowest commercial street in Canada, and which is remarkable not only for what is visible at street level, but for what extends beneath and behind and between the buildings that line it. Fan Tan Alley was developed in the 1880s and 1890s as the interior, commercial heart of Victoria's Chinatown. The buildings that front the alley open from the street as unremarkable 2- and 3-story brick structures. Inside and beneath them is a different story. The basements of these buildings were connected by passages that allowed movement between establishments without emerging onto the street. Rooms beneath the basement level of some buildings provided additional space that was not visible from outside. Some passages ran beneath the alley itself, connecting buildings on opposite sides. The purposes these spaces served evolved over time, and understanding them requires holding multiple histories simultaneously. In the period when opium was legal in Canada, which is to say before 1908, the Chinese-owned opium businesses of Victoria operated from basement and sub-basement spaces, partly for logistical reasons. The manufacturing and storage of opium required controlled conditions that below-grade spaces provided naturally, and partly for social ones. The mixed clientele that these establishments served included white Victorians who preferred privacy. After 1908, when possession and sale of opium became criminal under the Opium Act, the same spaces that had been operating semi-openly became genuinely hidden, and the connecting passages that allowed movement between buildings became operationally significant. Police records from the period document raids on opium establishments in Victoria's Chinatown that describe something consistent with a spatially sophisticated operation. When police entered through the front of a building, occupants and goods could move through passages to adjacent structures and exit elsewhere. Multiple entries were required to be effective, and effective simultaneous entries on multiple buildings required resources that the Victoria Police did not always deploy. The underground network was a practical countermeasure to the enforcement strategy the authorities were using. But opium was only one of the underground's functions. Gambling, also criminalized but also in significant demand from both Chinese and non-Chinese populations, was conducted in basement rooms throughout the Chinatown district. The same passages that allowed movement during police raids of opium establishments served equally well during raids on gambling rooms. The underground was a multi-purpose infrastructure of informal economic activity, maintained collectively by a community that had every reason to invest in its upkeep. There was also the labor market. Chinese workers in Victoria, as elsewhere, faced restrictions that channeled them into a narrow range of occupations. The networks through which those workers were organized, employed, and paid were conducted through the district's internal social structures rather than through the visible commercial channels of the city above. The underground spaces provided venues for meetings, for transactions, for the distribution of wages, and the allocation of work in forms that were invisible to the labor inspectors and tax collectors who monitored the legitimate surface economy. And there was, again, the dimension of physical safety. Victoria's history includes episodes of anti-Chinese violence. In 1907, the same year that a major riot devastated Vancouver's Chinatown, Victoria was tense enough that community leaders were making contingency plans for the protection of residents. Underground spaces provided options for concealment and movement that the surface did not. What makes the Victoria case more documentable than Moose Jaw, though still far from fully documented, is the partial survival of the physical spaces themselves and the existence of a somewhat richer body of oral history from community members whose families lived through the relevant period. Descendants of families who occupied the Fan Tan Alley buildings have, in some cases, provided detailed accounts of specific passages and their uses. These accounts are not in the official archives because they were never entered there. They exist in family memory, in the occasional recorded interview with an elder, in the patient listening of researchers who understood that the most important documentation of this history was never going to come from a government file. Archaeological investigation of the Fan Tan Alley underground has been limited, constrained by the fact that the buildings are still occupied and functioning, and that extensive excavation would be destructive. Some sections of the passage system have been closed off, modified, or partially demolished during various building renovations over the century. Others remain intact but inaccessible without cooperation from building owners who are not always interested in archaeological inquiry into their basements. What is visible to a researcher who approaches it carefully is consistent with what the oral history describes. There are surviving sections of passage beneath the district. Some of them show evidence of long and varied use. Some show modifications, walls built and then opened up, passages blocked and then unblocked, adaptations that make sense only if the spaces were being actively managed over time by people with changing needs. The physical record, incomplete as it is, matches the pattern of a community using underground space as a practical response to a surface world that denied them full participation. Victoria's underground also has a later chapter, one that intersects with the Prohibition era that dominates the Moose Jaw mythology. When the United States went dry in 1920 and British Columbia imposed its own partial prohibition, the passage of liquor through various channels became an important business. Victoria, as a port city with established connections to shipping, was a natural hub for liquor that was being moved in various directions to avoid various regulatory frameworks. The basement and passage systems of the commercial district serve some of these movements. The specific claim that connects Victoria most dramatically to Prohibition-era underground activity involves not just the Chinatown district, but a broader set of passages said to run beneath the inner harbor area, connecting waterfront warehouses to locations further inland. These claims are much harder to document than the Chinatown passages. The waterfront of Victoria has been extensively modified over the past century, and whatever passages may have existed in that area have been largely destroyed by development. What survives is mainly the oral tradition and a handful of documentary references that are suggestive without being conclusive. The Victoria case demonstrates something important about the underground history of Canada's West Coast cities more broadly. The spaces that were built and used by excluded communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not random or improvised. They reflected a sophisticated spatial intelligence, an understanding of how buildings relate to each other, how underground movement can substitute for surface movement, how spaces can serve multiple purposes simultaneously, and how an infrastructure of informality can be as functional and as purposeful as anything that appears in an official construction permit. The community that built and maintained that infrastructure has not, for the most part, been credited with it. The tunnel stories that circulate most widely emphasize the criminal associations, the opium, the gambling, the bootlegging, because those elements have the dramatic weight that popular storytelling requires. What they tend to obscure is the more fundamental reality that this was a community using every tool available to it to survive in a city that wanted its economic contribution but not its presence. The underground was the space that the surface refused to provide. It was architecture built under duress, and it should be understood as such. It should also be understood as only one part of a much larger underground story, because while Chinese communities in Victoria and Moose Jaw and other cities were building their alternative geography, another set of institutions entirely was also going underground. Not in the margins, not in the spaces that official society refused to offer, but with the full resources and intentions of the state, in tunnels built specifically to serve the interests of the government and the military. Those tunnels are their own story, and some of what they contain has still not been made fully public. There is a citadel in Halifax that sits on a hill above the harbor, its star-shaped earthen walls visible from most of the city, and inside and beneath those walls is a tunnel system that is documented, mapped, open to visitors in part, and still not fully understood. This seems like a contradiction. How can something be documented and still not fully understood? The answer tells you something important about the relationship between official record keeping and actual historical reality. Halifax Citadel was constructed in various phases beginning in the 1750s, though the current structure dates primarily from work done between 1828 and 1856. As the primary military fortification defending Halifax Harbor, it served as the operational heart of British military presence in Atlantic Canada for over a century and a half. Its tunnel system is substantial. Underground magazines, connecting passages, sally ports, and ammunition storage chambers are built into the earthworks in ways that are consistent with the military engineering of their period. The documented portions of this system have been studied by military historians and are part of the Parks Canada site interpretation. They are not mysterious in the conventional sense. You can read about them in academic papers and walk through some of them on a guided tour. But the Citadel also has sections that are not open to the public, and the documentation of what exists in those sections is not complete in the public record. Military engineers working in the 20th century added modifications and extensions to the 19th century system that were not entered into records that have been made fully available. Some of the deeper or more peripheral sections of the tunnel complex have not been comprehensively surveyed in the modern era. The simple fact of a well-documented military structure does not mean that everything within it has been documented. This is a pattern that repeats at military sites across Canada. The documentation is official and therefore, in one sense, authoritative. But official documentation is created for specific purposes and at specific moments, and it rarely captures everything that was built or modified or repurposed over the lifetime of a complex installation. Fort Henry in Kingston, Ontario, sits at the confluence of the St. Lawrence River and the Rideau Canal, a position of obvious strategic importance that was fortified beginning in the early 19th century. The current Fort Henry structure, completed in 1836, has an extensive system of underground passages and chambers built into its walls and ramparts. These are partially documented and partially open to visitors. Like the Halifax Citadel, the fort also has sections that have not been fully surveyed in recent decades, and the full extent of the connecting passages between various parts of the fortification remains incompletely mapped in publicly available sources. These are not mysteries in the conspiratorial sense. Nobody is hiding anything nefarious in the tunnels under Fort Henry. But the habit of treating documented military infrastructure as fully understood because it is documented is one that the physical evidence repeatedly undermines. Buildings are modified, tunnels are extended, connections are added, chambers are sealed. All of this happens over decades and centuries, and the administrative records that capture it are uneven in their completeness and availability. The Rideau Canal itself deserves attention here because it represents a remarkable piece of underground and semi-underground military engineering that most people who use it as a recreational waterway today do not fully appreciate. Built between 1826 and 1832 under the supervision of Lieutenant Colonel John By of the Royal Engineers. The Rideau Canal was constructed specifically as a military supply route that would allow movement of troops and material between Montreal and Kingston without exposure to American attack along the St. Lawrence. Its locks, dams, and associated infrastructure required significant earthworks, and in several locations, the construction involved excavation of tunnels and chambers to house the lock mechanisms and to allow maintenance access. At Bytown, which became Ottawa, the northern terminus of the canal involved the excavation of a sandstone ridge to allow the canal to descend to the Ottawa River. This excavation created what are known as the Rideau Canal locks, still operational today, and also created a series of chambers and passages within the stone that were used for various purposes over the following decades. And these spaces have been studied, but their full extent and the history of their use over nearly 2 centuries of the canal's operation is not comprehensively documented. Ottawa itself adds another layer. As the national capital, Ottawa has served for over 150 years as the operational heart of the Canadian government, and the Parliament Hill complex and surrounding government buildings have accumulated underground connections, tunnels, and infrastructure that reflect both the practical needs of managing a large governmental campus and the security concerns of various periods. The tunnels connecting various federal buildings in the parliamentary precinct are not entirely secret, but they are not entirely public either. Security concerns have limited documentation of what exists and where it runs, and the modifications made during various periods of heightened security, during the 2 world wars, during the Cold War, and after various security incidents of more recent decades, are not reflected in any comprehensive public record. This is where the military underground history of Canada begins to shade into the category of things that are not truly unknown to the relevant authorities, but are genuinely not part of the public historical record. There is a difference between mysterious and classified, and some of what exists beneath Canadian government buildings falls into the latter category rather than the former. But classified information left in that state long enough and across enough institutional transitions can effectively become mysterious to the public, to researchers, and in some cases even to the officials nominally responsible for the spaces. The most extreme example of this dynamic in Canadian history is not in Ottawa, though Ottawa has its own version of it. The most extreme example is a former military installation 60 kilometers west of the capital, in a small township on the edge of the Canadian Shield, where during the late 1950s the government of Canada dug a hole and built something that was not acknowledged publicly for decades, and that even now, as a museum, does not tell the complete story of what it was designed for and what decisions were made inside it. In 1958, the government of Canada began digging a 4-story underground structure into the rock and clay of the Carp Valley, west of Ottawa, under conditions of considerable secrecy. The workers who built it knew they were building something for the government. They did not know what. The local residents who saw vehicles coming and going, who noticed the construction activity without being able to observe it directly, had their questions deflected or simply not answered. The project was known by a bureaucratic designation that gave nothing away. When it was complete in 1961, the structure contained a war operations room, a CBC broadcasting studio, a miniature hospital, a decontamination facility, sleeping quarters for 535 people, and an emergency communication system capable of operating independently of the national telephone network. It was designed to house the federal cabinet, the Bank of Canada's gold reserves, and the senior military and civilian leadership of the country in the event of a nuclear attack. The walls were reinforced concrete, multiple meters thick. The blast doors were designed to withstand pressures that would destroy any conventional structure above ground. It was called the Diefenbunker, after Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, though that nickname came later, and with a sardonic edge that reflected the public's eventual reaction to the revelation that such a facility had existed, and that the plan for nuclear survival apparently involved saving the cabinet while doing very little for anyone else. The Diefenbunker is now a museum. You can buy a ticket and walk through it, read the interpretive panels, see the recreated operations room, and the broadcasting studio, and the blast doors. This openness is genuinely useful for understanding what the Cold War government was thinking and how it planned for catastrophe. But the Diefenbunker was not the only such facility. It was not even the primary one. The Canadian government's Cold War emergency planning infrastructure included a network of what were called Emergency Government Headquarters, or EGHQs, distributed across the country, at least one in each province, in locations chosen for geological stability, reasonable distance from obvious nuclear targets, and discretion. These facilities varied in size and sophistication, from relatively modest converted structures to purpose-built underground installations similar in kind to the Diefenbunker, if smaller in scale. They were designed to house provincial governments and key personnel in the event that the main urban centers were destroyed. Some of these facilities have been decommissioned and are now known to researchers and historians. Others have been demolished. Some are documented only in archival records that require considerable persistence to locate and interpret. And a few, particularly those associated with communications and intelligence functions rather than simple governmental continuity, remain in a documentary gray zone, acknowledged to exist in general terms, but not fully described in any public record. The existence of this network is not conspiracy theory. It is documented government policy reflected in federal and provincial emergency management records from the 1950s through the 1980s. What is less fully documented is the physical specifics, exactly where each facility was, what it contained, how it was modified over the decades of the Cold War, and what happened to it afterward. Decommissioning records are incomplete. Some facilities were sold to private owners without the full history of what was in the ground being disclosed. Some were handed to municipalities or provincial governments with documentation that was, charitably speaking, not comprehensive. The communications dimension adds its own layer. Canada's Cold War military communications network required a physical infrastructure of underground cables, relay stations, and protected facilities that extended across the country in ways that have not been fully documented in public sources. Some of this infrastructure was shared with the broader North American network, coordinated through agreements with the United States military. Some of it was distinctly Canadian. Some of it was built in collaboration with British intelligence services under agreements that remain partially classified. This is not the romantic mystery of hidden treasure or ancient civilization. It is the more mundane and in some ways more troubling mystery of a democratic government's relationship with its own citizens during a period of genuine existential fear. The Cold War underground of Canada is the physical record of decisions made in secret by officials who genuinely believed they were acting in the national interest about what would be saved and what would be sacrificed in the event of nuclear war. That those decisions were never submitted to democratic deliberation, that the physical infrastructure recording them was built without public knowledge, and in many cases dismantled or converted without public accounting, is a historical fact that the available documentation only partially captures. What the tunnels and bunkers of the Cold War era add to the broader story of Canada's mysterious underground is a particular kind of institutional amnesia, not the erasure of a persecuted community's history, though that erasure happened above ground in parallel, not the covering over of ancient knowledge by a colonial framework that couldn't accommodate it. This was the state itself forgetting or declining to remember what it built in its own name under its own authority, for purposes that it decided the public did not need to know. That institutional forgetting has its own archaeology, facilities repurposed without their history being disclosed, tunnels that end at doors no one can explain on current-day maps, infrastructure that appears in one set of records and not in others, in ways that suggest not accidental omission, but deliberate removal. Finding those traces requires a different kind of patience from the patience required to read charcoal layers in a prairie basement, but it is not so different in its basic structure. Something was here, something happened. The record of it was incomplete by design, and the physical evidence, carefully read, can sometimes say more than the documents were allowed to. There is a third category of underground anomaly in Canada that sits outside the human histories of persecution and governance, or at least seems to, and it is, in some ways, the most difficult to discuss responsibly because it is the category that conspiracy culture has most thoroughly colonized. Across Canada, there are geological formations that don't quite fit the standard explanatory frameworks, passages in rock that appear too regular to be purely natural, chambers in cliff faces that have dimensions and proportions that suggest intentionality, underground spaces that appear on the geological record but are not explained by any identified process of natural cave formation. Some of these have simple explanations that simply require the right expert to supply them. Some have more complex and still contested explanations, and a small number have not yet been satisfactorily explained by anyone, natural or human. The honest version of this discussion requires separating several categories that are often muddled together in popular treatments of the subject. First, there are natural cave systems. Canada has thousands of these, and many of them are extraordinary. The Castleguard Cave in Banff National Park penetrates beneath the Columbia icefield and is, at roughly 20 kilometers of mapped passage, one of the longest caves in Canada. The Paint Pots Caves near Radium Hot Springs in British Columbia. The karst systems beneath parts of British Columbia's interior, where water-dissolving limestone over thousands of years has created chambers and passages that are still being mapped. Some of these natural systems contain evidence of indigenous use going back thousands of years, which is itself historically significant and not fully documented. But the caves themselves are natural. They were carved by water and chemistry, not by hands. Second, there are geological formations that look artificial but are not. Columnar. Basalt, formed when lava cools slowly and contracts. Neck produces remarkably regular geometric shapes. Hexagonal columns can form cliff faces and cavern entrances that have a strikingly architectural quality. Differential erosion of rock layers with different hardness can produce regular seeming shelves and niches in cliff faces. Natural tunnels form through a variety of processes, some of which produce passages with dimensions and proportions that would not look out of place in a constructed structure. Knowing what these natural processes look like and distinguishing them from human construction requires geological expertise that is not always available to the people who first encounter these formations. Third, there are spaces that were natural in origin but have been significantly modified by human activity. Caves used as shelters were sometimes enlarged. Natural passages were extended or modified to create storage or habitation spaces. The boundary between natural and constructed in these cases is genuinely blurry, and the extent of human modification is often difficult to assess without careful archaeological investigation. Fourth, and this is the category that matters most for an honest account of Canada's underground mysteries, there are underground spaces that cannot be explained by either natural geological processes or the known history of human construction in their area. These are not common. They are not, as far as the available evidence suggests, the work of ancient civilizations building pyramids in the Manitoba bedrock, or anything of that order. But they exist, and the honest position is to acknowledge them, rather than to paper over them with explanations that don't quite fit. In the Caribou region of British Columbia, there are passages in certain cliff formations that have been observed by hikers and climbers whose geological training is sufficient to recognize that the passages don't look like the natural processes that shape the surrounding rock. The passages are not elaborately constructed. They are not cathedral-like chambers. They are simply spaces in rock that have the wrong profile for natural origin, openings that are too regular, floors that are too level, corners that are too sharp. Without more systematic investigation, which the rugged terrain makes logistically difficult, the explanation for these spaces remains open. In northern Ontario, in rock country that has been occupied by Anishinaabe peoples for thousands of years and by geological time for billions, there are occasional reports of underground spaces whose character and extent don't match immediately documented geology of the area. Some of these reports come from mining operations, which have the advantage of employing people with professional knowledge of what rock looks like when it hasn't been touched and what it looks like when something has worked on it. Mining engineers who encounter an anomalous underground space in the course of drilling or excavation are not prone to romanticizing it. When some of them have said that a particular space doesn't look natural, that observation deserves to be taken seriously. The difficulty is following up. Mining companies are not in the business of archaeological investigation now, and they have practical incentives to process anomalies quickly and move on. Academic researchers who might want to investigate carefully face challenges of access, funding, and institutional support for what is inevitably a speculative inquiry without guaranteed publishable results. The anomalies get reported, sometimes in informal channels, sometimes in internal company communications, and then they disappear from the accessible record. There is also, running through this entire category, the problem of indigenous knowledge that has not been integrated into the scientific framework. As discussed in an earlier section of this story, oral traditions in many indigenous nations describe underground spaces in specific geographic areas with a specificity that is difficult to account for as pure metaphor. Some of those traditions describe spaces in areas where geological anomalies have been independently reported. The potential connection between the oral tradition and the physical anomaly has not been systematically investigated in most cases, because doing so would require the kind of sustained, respectful, and genuinely collaborative work between indigenous knowledge holders and earth scientists that has rarely been adequately resourced or institutionally supported. This is not the fringe of the story. This is, in some ways, its center. The most genuinely mysterious underground spaces in Canada are not the ones that can be explained if you find the right historical document. They are the ones that sit at the intersection of geological anomaly and deep indigenous knowledge of a landscape, each in an investigative void created by inadequate resources, inadequate collaboration, and a century and a half of scientific practice that treated indigenous knowledge as irrelevant to geological inquiry. What lives in that void is not ancient aliens or secret civilizations, or the kind of dramatic revelation that popular entertainment requires. What lives there is a serious scholarly question that has not yet been seriously asked with the right combination of tools and knowledge and openness to what the answer might be. That question deserves better than it has so far received. The ground beneath Canada is old enough and complex enough and known deeply enough by people whose knowledge has not been adequately incorporated into the official account that the honest position is one of genuine uncertainty. Not the performed uncertainty of someone setting up a conspiracy theory. The actual uncertainty of an inquiry that is real and not yet resolved. When you lay out the evidence for Canada's underground history, the documented and the partially documented and the genuinely anomalous, a question begins to form that is harder to answer than any individual question about a specific tunnel or a specific site. The question is structural. Why doesn't the official account of Canadian history take any of this seriously? Some of the answer is simply the ordinary conservatism of academic disciplines, the preference for well-documented claims over suggestive evidence, the institutional structures that reward precision over speculation, the understandable reluctance to stake professional reputation on claims that can't be fully verified. These are not bad impulses. They are what makes scholarship reliable. But some of the answer is something more uncomfortable, and it has to do with whose history is being discussed and who controls the narrative of that history. The underground history of Canada, as this story has tried to show, belongs disproportionately to people who were excluded from the surface narrative. Chinese Canadians whose communities were built in the spaces the dominant society refused to provide. Indigenous peoples whose knowledge of the land, including its underground, was systematically suppressed and dismissed. Communities of color who used the underground as a practical response to being denied full participation in the visible city. And in a different key, those same communities as the government later went underground for its own purposes in ways it preferred not to discuss. The historians who have been slowest to engage with this material are often not opposed to it in principle. They simply have not had the training, the access to community sources, the linguistic ability, or the collaborative relationships with the communities whose history is involved that would allow them to approach the material adequately. And some have operated from frameworks that treat the absence of official documentation as equivalent to absence of significance, a position that systematically underweights the histories of communities that had strong reasons to avoid official documentation. The historians who have engaged most seriously with the underground are, not coincidentally, often those with the most direct connection to the communities involved. Chinese Canadian historians who have spent careers recovering documentation from community sources rather than government archives. Indigenous scholars who bring training in both Western academic methods and traditional knowledge frameworks. Historians of marginalized communities who have developed methods for reading the partial and indirect evidence that is all that survives of spaces that were built to be invisible. The conversations between these groups are not always easy. The methodological standards that allow a claim to be taken seriously in one scholarly community do not always map neatly onto what another community accepts as sufficient evidence. The oral tradition that a Chinese Canadian historian might treat as credible primary testimony is something that an archaeologist trained in strict material evidentiary standards might be reluctant to cite directly. The physical evidence that an archaeologist finds suggestive might not, without corroborating documentation, rise to the standard that a documentary historian would require. These methodological differences are real and cannot simply be wished away, but they do not, on reflection, justify the degree to which the underground history of Canada has remained marginal in the mainstream historical literature. The evidence that exists, taken in total, is substantial enough that serious engagement would be warranted even by the most conservative scholarly standards. The tunnels are real. The communities that built them or use them are real, with documented histories that provide the necessary context. The physical evidence, however incompletely investigated, is consistent with the community, histories in ways that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. What the historians most directly disagree about can be organized into a few specific clusters. The first cluster is the question of intentionality. Were the underground spaces of Moose Jaw, Victoria, and other cities deliberately planned as a community infrastructure, or were they improvised responses to immediate needs that were not part of a broader strategy? the answer probably varies by location and by period, and the distinction matters less than it might seem. Because improvised community responses to systemic exclusion are not less significant historically than planned ones. They may in fact be more significant because they demonstrate the practical ingenuity of communities working with very limited resources under very difficult conditions. The second cluster is temporal. How old are the oldest sections of tunnel beneath Canadian cities? And do any sections predate the communities they are associated with by a margin that requires a different explanation? This question gets at some of the most genuinely unresolved aspects of the underground. The Moose Jaw tunnels specifically contain sections that some investigators have suggested predate the steam heat utility system to which they are officially attributed. And definitively resolving this question would require systematic archaeological dating of materials from the tunnel walls and floor, work that has not been done with the rigor that would settle the question. Until it is, the temporal question remains genuinely open. The third cluster is geographical. How extensive were the underground networks, and did they connect sites that are not currently known to be connected? This is partly a question of what future investigation might find, and partly a question of what the surviving physical evidence, read carefully, already suggests. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of downtown blocks in several Canadian cities have produced results that deserve follow-up investigation that has not, for the most part, occurred. The fourth cluster is the most politically significant. Whose history is being honored when the underground spaces of Canadian cities are interpreted? The tourist narrative of the Moose Jaw tunnels, which emphasizes Al Capone and dramatic Prohibition-era adventure, is significantly more comfortable for mainstream Canadian culture than a narrative that centers the experience of Chinese Canadians who were subjected to one of the most systematically exclusionary policies in Canadian history. Capone is a good story. The Chinese Exclusion Act is a shameful one. The physical spaces beneath Moose Jaw have been used to tell the Capone story and to give only partial attention to the other. This is not unique to Moose Jaw. Underground spaces across Canada have been interpreted in ways that emphasize the dramatic and the entertaining while underplaying or omitting the histories of the communities that actually built or relied on them. Changing that interpretive pattern requires not just different scholarship, but different institutional choices about which histories deserve public prominence. Those choices are being made slowly as pressure from affected communities and their scholarly allies shifts the terms of the conversation. But the shift is incomplete, and the official narrative has not yet caught up to the full complexity of what is in the ground. To understand why so much of Canada's underground history remains unknown, you have to think about what happens to a tunnel when no one uses it for 50 years. And the answer is instructive and a little melancholy. Tunnels are not passive structures. Unlike a stone building that can stand empty for centuries, a tunnel requires continuous maintenance to retain its character as a usable space. The earth around it is always moving, in small ways, constantly. Frost heave pushes walls inward in winter. Spring water seeps through mortar joints. Tree roots find cracks and follow them, patiently, year by year, exerting a force that no brick construction was designed to resist indefinitely. Without someone regularly checking, shoring up, remortaring, clearing drainage, the tunnel begins to change. First subtly, a slight inward lean of a wall, a crack in the ceiling that lets a thin line of soil through, a floor that begins to hold water after heavy rain, then more noticeably, then in a decade or two, fundamentally, the wooden tunnel supports of the 19th century fare worst. Untreated timber in contact with soil and periodic moisture can lose structural integrity in 10 to 20 years. Once the support fails, the surrounding soil shifts to fill the available space. A timber-frame tunnel passage might, within a human generation of abandonment, become a zone of compressed and disturbed soil whose only evidence of its former existence is a slight linear depression in the surface above, or an anomalous area of soft ground that doesn't match its surroundings, or, visible only to ground-penetrating radar, a zone of different density in the soil profile. Brick-constructed passages last longer, decades rather than years before catastrophic structural failure, but they too are vulnerable to the same forces, and in the wet-dry cycles of Canadian seasonal extremes, they are particularly vulnerable to the freeze-thaw process. Water that enters a brick joint expands by about 9% when it freezes. In cold climates, that expansion and contraction, repeated hundreds of times over the life of a wall, eventually defeats the mortar. Sections of brick displace. Walls bow. The vault that holds the ceiling up loses its compression, and the ceiling comes down. What remains after this process has run for 50 or 100 years is often difficult to distinguish from naturally disturbed soil and rock. The excavator's eye, trained to look for the straight line and the right angle and the manufactured surface that signals human construction, can sometimes see through the disturbance to the original intention of a space. More often, without additional tools, it cannot. In urban Canada, the process of built-over forgetting is faster still. When a building above a tunnel system is demolished and replaced, the construction process for the new structure commonly involves osmose excavation that destroys any tunnel features immediately below the demolished footprint. The new building's foundations press down through whatever existed before. The contractor follows the plan and does not investigate anomalies unless they threaten the structural integrity of what is being built. Anomalous spaces found during construction are a problem to be solved, not a mystery to be preserved. They are filled, reinforced, or avoided, and the paperwork generated describes them functionally rather than historically. The cumulative effect of this process over a century of urban development in Canadian cities has been substantial. Every block of downtown Moose Jaw, Victoria, Halifax, and Ottawa that has seen a building demolished and replaced in the last 100 years has potentially had underground history. Destroyed in the process, the pace of that destruction accelerated in the urban renewal era of the 1960s and 1970s, when large blocks of older buildings were cleared for new development, often in exactly the areas where the most historically significant underground spaces were most likely to exist. The older commercial districts that had served as the social centers of marginalized communities. The heritage protection frameworks that might have preserved some of this history did not, for the most part, treat underground spaces as heritage assets. Above-ground historic buildings were a recognized category with legal frameworks for protection. By the 1970s, underground spaces, with rare exceptions, were not. The Chinese-Canadian community tunnels of Victoria's Chinatown were not, as a category, eligible for the designation processes that might have slowed the pace of their modification or destruction. This was partly a matter of the communities involved not having the political standing, until relatively recently, to advocate effectively for the preservation of their heritage. Partly, it was the more straightforward invisibility problem. You cannot protect heritage you don't know exists. The indigenous dimension of this forgetting is, as in every other aspect of this story, its own and more profound form of loss. When sacred or significant underground spaces in indigenous territories were destroyed by development, there was rarely any mechanism to document what was lost before it was gone. The knowledge of what those spaces were and why they mattered existed in oral tradition and in the knowledge of specific people, knowledge that was not solicited by the development process and was not entered into any compensating record. The combination of physical destruction and the parallel destruction of the knowledge frameworks within which those spaces had meaning represents a kind of double erasure that standard archival methods cannot easily address. What this means in practice for the researcher trying to understand Canada's underground is a series of investigative strategies that are uncomfortably indirect. You look for the traces that are most resistant to destruction. Charcoal, as noted, persists. Ceramics persist. Metal artifacts persist. The distinctive chemical signature of human habitation, elevated phosphorus, specific organic compounds, altered soil pH, persists in the soil even when the physical structure that created those conditions is long gone. These geochemical traces can be detected by careful sampling and laboratory analysis, and they can, in some cases, place human habitation in a location and approximate time period even when every physical structure above that habitation has been destroyed. Ground-penetrating radar, which sends pulses of electromagnetic energy into the ground and measures the reflections that return from boundaries between materials of different density, which can detect the void left by a collapsed tunnel even after the tunnel has filled with disturbed soil. The soil that falls into a collapsed tunnel differs in compaction and composition from the undisturbed soil around it, and that difference persists for decades or centuries. A trained interpreter looking at a ground-penetrating radar profile can identify probable former tunnel locations even in the absence of any physical access. These methods have been applied to some Canadian urban sites, and the results are suggestive in ways that warrant follow-up investigation. In some downtown blocks where oral history and documentary evidence suggest underground spaces existed, ground-penetrating radar surveys have produced anomalies consistent with collapsed or filled tunnel features. Those anomalies have not, in most cases, been followed up with excavation to confirm or disprove the interpretation. The resources for that kind of work are not routinely available, and the institutional will to pursue questions that might produce historically uncomfortable answers is not always present. The forgetting, in other words, is not a finished process. It is ongoing, and it is not entirely innocent. Some of what has been lost was lost without malice through the ordinary processes of urban development and the natural decay of unprotected structures. But some of it was lost because the history it represented was not considered worth the cost of preserving, and that assessment reflected the same value judgments that had marginalized those communities in the first place. What has survived the forgetting, in physical form and in memory and in oral tradition and in the slowly expanding scholarly record, is enough to know that something significant was lost. Whether it is enough to recover an adequate account of what was there is the question that the next generation of archaeological and historical scholarship in Canada will have to answer. Begin in a van parked on a quiet side street in downtown Moose Jaw on a fall morning. The ground-penetrating radar unit is being lowered from the back, its antenna array laid flat against the pavement. The operator checks the display, adjusts the settings, and begins pushing it slowly along the sidewalk. On the screen, a cross-section of the earth below, the concrete appears in real time, rendered in colors that correspond to the intensity of reflected signal. Solid, undisturbed soil looks one way, disturbed soil looks another, a void looks different still. An old void, partly collapsed and partly filled, produces a particular signature that the experienced interpreter knows to look for. This kind of survey, which would have been impossible a generation ago and is still not cheap or simple, is one of several tools that are beginning to change what it is possible to know about the underground of Canadian cities without excavation. The technology has a limit, which is that it confirms the location of subsurface anomalies without definitively characterizing them. It says something is here, but not precisely what. Confirming the characterization requires either excavation or additional investigation. using other methods, but as a first pass, as a way of identifying locations that warrant further attention, a ground-penetrating radar is transforming the investigative possibilities. And what it is finding in the limited surveys that have been conducted in historically relevant locations is enough to suggest that the physical record of Canada's underground history is more extensive than the deterioration of above-ground documentation would suggest. In Victoria, researchers affiliated with the University of Victoria and the University of British Columbia have been working with community organizations from the Chinese-Canadian community to map surviving underground features in and around the Fan Tan Alley district. The combination of oral history, archival research, and geophysical surveying has produced a partial map of the passage system that is considerably more extensive than what the tourism literature acknowledges. And some sections of the system that were assumed to have been destroyed by 20th century development appear to have survived in modified form. Others that were not previously known to researchers have been identified through the geophysical work. The collaborative model matters here. The geophysical survey without the oral history would have produced anomalies without context, blobs of different density in the ground that might or might not be tunnel-related. The oral history without the geophysical survey would have remained unverifiable tradition. Together, they produce something that neither could achieve alone, a physically grounded account of a community's spatial history that has the credibility of corroborated evidence. In Moose Jaw, similar work has begun, though it has proceeded more slowly and with less institutional support. The challenge in Moose Jaw is partly that the tourism operation in the documented tunnels has a commercial interest in controlling the narrative, which does not always align with the interests of open scholarly inquiry. But researchers working independently of the tourism operation have conducted preliminary surveys and archival work that suggest the documented section of tunnel is smaller than the full system that existed, and that sections of the system whose existence is supported by oral tradition and historical documentation have physical correlates detectable by non-invasive survey. Ground-penetrating radar is not the only tool in use. Light detection and ranging, the same technology that revealed geoglyphs beneath the Amazon canopy, is being applied to urban environments in Canada with results that are sometimes unexpected. In above-ground applications, LiDAR can reveal the faint outlines of earthworks, raised surfaces, and modified topography that indicate previous construction even where no structure remains. In certain locations along Canadian rivers and lake shores where pre-colonial settlement patterns are being investigated, LiDAR is revealing surface modifications that correspond to areas identified in indigenous oral tradition as significant places, some of which have underground components that subsequent excavation has confirmed. Geochemical analysis of soil samples is another non-invasive tool that is yielding results. In areas where surface investigation suggests the possibility of historical habitation, systematic soil sampling can detect the chemical signatures of human occupation, elevated phosphorus from organic waste decomposition, charcoal fragments, altered pH, changes in microbial communities that reflect past disturbance. These signatures can be detected even where the physical structures associated with them have been completely destroyed, because the soil chemistry changes caused by sustained human occupation persist for centuries. The combination of these tools with the careful, culturally grounded archival and oral historical work that the best researchers in the field are doing is producing, slowly and unevenly, a revised map of the underground. That map is not complete. In many areas, the necessary surveys have not been done. In others, the surveys have been done, but the follow-up excavation required to confirm the interpretations has not been funded. In still others, the results of surveys are sitting in unpublished reports. Known to a small circle of researchers, but not yet integrated into the wider scholarly literature. The revised map that is emerging, even in its incomplete form, tells a story that is consistently different from the official account in one key respect. It shows more spatial extent, more complexity, more evidence of purposeful design than the official narrative has acknowledged. Whether that more will eventually resolve the most genuinely mysterious questions about the underground, whether it will explain the anomalous sections of the Moose Jaw tunnels, whether it will corroborate the indigenous oral traditions about underground passages in ways that the physical record can confirm, whether it will reveal Cold War infrastructure whose existence has been quietly denied, is not yet clear. But the direction of the evidence is consistent. The official account underestimated the underground. The physical evidence, read with adequate tools and adequate humility, is larger and stranger and more human than the official account ever allowed it to be. If you step back from all of this, the radar profiles and the pottery sherds and the oral traditions and the archival gaps and the Cold War bunkers and the Chinatown passages, and you let the pieces settle into some kind of coherence, a different Canada begins to emerge from beneath the one on the official maps. Not a secret Canada in the conspiratorial sense, not a land of hidden treasures and ancient mysteries that resolves into a dramatic revelation. Something stranger and more human than that. A Canada whose underground is layered with purposes and peoples that the surface narrative has consistently underestimated, where the stone and clay and timber beneath the cities hold the residue of communities that were told they had no place on the surface, and who responded with ingenuity and practical courage by building their place below it, where the rock of the shield and the limestone of the mountain country preserve both the geological memory of an ancient continent and the cultural memory of peoples whose knowledge of that rock runs back thousands of years in forms that no colonial document ever adequately captured, where the government of a democratic country dug its own secrets into the earth and has not, even now, given a full account of what it put there. The tunnels beneath Canada do not point to a single story. They point to several stories that are connected not by a shared author, but by a shared dynamic. The underground, across all of these histories, is where people go when the surface excludes them. It is the space that remains when all the sanctioned spaces have been claimed, and the communities and institutions that have used it have all, in their different ways, left evidence in the earth that the official account was not designed to find. The Chinese workers who built the most dangerous sections of the transcontinental railway and then found themselves legally excluded from the country they had helped to build. They understood the underground in both senses, the literal space beneath the city that was available when the surface was not, bezatnam, and the metaphorical underground of an existence that the official economy and the official culture required to be invisible. What they built in that space, in Moose Jaw and Victoria and smaller communities across the West, was not merely a hiding place. It was a community infrastructure, a parallel civic life conducted below the threshold of official visibility. The indigenous nations whose knowledge of this land, including its underground, stretches back thousands of years before any colonial map was drawn. They understood that the distinction between surface and underground, between what is visible and what is hidden, is a distinction that the land itself does not make. The karst systems of British Columbia, the sacred caves of the Shield, the pit house villages of the interior plateau, and the oral traditions about underground passages that non-indigenous scholars have been so slow to take seriously, all of these represent a relationship with the underground that is more intimate and more ancient than anything the colonial period produced. The government that built its emergency bunkers and its communication tunnels and its continuity of government infrastructure in the anxious decades of the Cold War, and then declined to give a full public account of what it had built and why. Even governments, it turns out, sometimes go underground when the surface seems too exposed, when the visibility that democratic governance requires feels like a liability in the face of existential threat. The bunkers beneath the Canadian Shield are a record of democratic government's relationship with its own fears, and they are not fully documented even now. And then there are the genuinely unexplained things, the geological anomalies that don't fit the standard frameworks, the sections of tunnel whose age and purpose remain contested, the physical evidence that corroborates oral traditions in ways that the existing investigative tools cannot fully resolve. These are not fabrications, and they are not, most of them, the result of wishful thinking or insufficient expertise. They are the residue of genuine complexity in a landscape that has been deeply and repeatedly inhabited by peoples whose knowledge of it has not been adequately incorporated into the investigation. The Amazon, in the feeder script of this kind of inquiry, was not an untouched wilderness. It was a landscape remembered, a forest that had been worked by millions of hands, and then abandoned, and then overgrown, and then systematically misread by observers who could not see past their own assumptions about what significant human presence looked like. The underground of Canada is not the Amazon, but the pattern of misreading is similar. The assumption that nothing significant was happening in a space because the evidence of what was happening is not legible to the frameworks available has distorted the account in ways that are only now being corrected. The correction is slow and incomplete, and not yet institutionally supported in the way that the question deserves, but it is happening. Somewhere beneath Moose Jaw, past the documented section of tunnel that the tourism operation controls, now a passage runs in a direction that the steam heat utility maps do not explain. A brick wall that is older than it should be faces a timber support that has been dated to a decade before the official record says the tunnel system was built. A ceramic fragment from a kitchen vessel of the 1890s sits in soil that has been disturbed by human activity in ways that don't match the documented industrial use of the space. Somewhere beneath Victoria's inner harbor, below the silt of a century of development, there may be the remnants of a passage system whose full extent was never mapped, and whose history was never entered into any file that a researcher will easily find. Somewhere in the Canadian Shield, and in a valley that was known to Anishinaabe peoples by a name that encodes information about the underground that no geologist has yet thought to ask about, there is a formation that does not match the documented geology of the surrounding rock. Somewhere in a decommissioned facility in a small Ontario township, the rooms designed to house a government in the aftermath of a war that did not happen are still there, their history partially told and partially not. The tunnels do not speak in our language. They do not announce their significance or explain their purposes. They simply persist, or fail to persist, in the ways that stone and brick and timber and soil allow or require, and they wait for the questions to become precise enough, and the tools to become adequate enough, and the collaborative relationships between the people who know different pieces of the story to become sufficiently trusting that the questions can be answered. Some of those answers are close. The ground-penetrating radar is getting better. The archival work is getting more careful. The collaborations between indigenous scholars and earth scientists are producing results that neither could have reached alone. The Chinese-Canadian historical community has been patient and persistent in ways that are beginning to change the institutional framework of what counts as evidence. Other answers are further away or may not come at all. Some tunnels have been destroyed beyond reconstruction. Some knowledge was lost with the people who held it, and no technology will recover it. Some institutional records will remain classified long enough that whatever context would make them interpretable will itself have become historical. But the underground of Canada is not, and has never been, as empty as the official story required it to be. What was built down there by the excluded and the persecuted and the ingenious and the fearful and the ancient is part of the country's real history. The history that happens in the spaces that official maps do not show. The history that is conducted below the threshold of the visible by people whose existence the surface was designed to ignore. That history is in the ground. And the ground, as it turns out, has a very long memory. If these tunnels have caught your curiosity tonight, if the idea of an underground that holds more than the official map suggests has settled into your thinking in the way that certain ideas do, you can help this kind of quiet investigation continue. A tap on the like button tells the algorithm that slow, careful storytelling about the things that have been hidden is worth surfacing. A subscription means that the next time a story like this one finds its way toward you, it actually gets there. And if you're still awake enough to feel like it, leave a comment before you drift. Tell me where you are and what is beneath your feet, city or forest or prairie or coast, old ground or new. It is always interesting to imagine the layers, the accumulated history of a specific patch of earth that never made it into the official record. However you carry this one forward, the invitation is simple. The next time you walk a street in any Canadian city, let yourself wonder, just briefly, what might be below the concrete, what purposes the darkness there has served, whose hands shaped those spaces, and whose lives were conducted in them. The ground beneath you is not blank. It remembers. And if you listen in the right way, with enough patience and enough willingness to hear what the official story left out, it will tell you things that are stranger and more human and more important than anything on the map above it. Good night. Sleep well. The tunnels will still be there in the morning. There is a story about tunnels that Canada has been comfortable telling because it ends well, or at least ends better than the stories that came before it. It involves people arriving in Canada from the United States. Mine crossing the border at the end of a journey that was conducted largely underground in the metaphorical sense of that word, through hidden routes and safe houses and the careful geography of compassion, organized against a system of brutal legality. The Underground Railroad was not, for the most part, literally underground. The name described a network of covert assistance that helped enslaved people from the American South escape to freedom in the North, and after 1850, when American law made the North unsafe, to Canada. The routes were conducted through houses, barns, churches, and forests. The stations were above ground. The railroad was underground only in the sense that it was hidden, conducted in the space between what the law permitted and what conscience required. But in some locations, and this is where the story intersects with the literal underground that this script has been following, the safe houses and gathering places of the Freedom Network in Canada did involve underground spaces, cellars where people could be hidden while patrols passed, root cellars and storage chambers beneath barns that doubled as temporary shelters. In some cases, connecting passages between buildings in communities that had established African Canadian populations, passages that served the same function as the passages in the Chinese communities of the West Coast, allowing movement without exposure to a hostile surface world. The African Canadian communities that received freedom seekers were concentrated in particular parts of southern Ontario, in Nova Scotia, and in parts of Quebec. Towns like Dresden, Chatham, and Buxton in Ontario became centers of relatively established black communities with the full architecture of community life, churches, schools, newspapers, businesses, and the physical infrastructure of mutual protection that included underground spaces in some instances. The documentation of these underground spaces is, again, limited by the fact that the communities who used them had good reasons not to document them extensively, A cellar that could hide a freedom seeker was only useful if its location was known to the people who needed it and unknown to those who might report it. The oral tradition within some of these communities has preserved knowledge of specific spaces, specific farm properties, specific church basements that serve these functions. The physical archaeology of some sites has corroborated those traditions in partial ways. What is less often acknowledged is that this history of underground refuge extended beyond the pre-Civil War period. After American slavery was abolished, and the specific threat of capture and return under the Fugitive Slave Act no longer applied, African Canadian communities in places like Chatham and Windsor and Amherstburg continued to navigate a Canadian reality that was less violently hostile than the American South, but was not by any measure free of racism and exclusion. The underground spaces that had served one purpose in one era were repurposed as community, gathered in new configurations, still valued for the protection they offered against a surface world that did not always welcome black presence. And the archaeology of these spaces has received even less systematic attention than the Chinese Canadian underground, and the oral traditions associated with them have been recorded even more fragmentarily. This is partly a matter of the communities involved being smaller and more geographically dispersed than the urban Chinese Canadian communities of the West Coast. It is partly a matter of the historical scholarship on African Canadian history having been even more thoroughly marginalized in mainstream Canadian historiography than Chinese Canadian history. And it is partly a matter of the specific character of the evidence, which is distributed across a large rural geography rather than concentrated in a single urban district where surveys might be concentrated. What the African Canadian underground adds to the broader picture is an insistence on seeing the underground of Canada not as a single phenomenon, with a single cause, but as a pattern that recurs wherever people find themselves, excluded from full participation in the surface world. The mechanisms of exclusion are different in each case. The head tax in the Chinese Exclusion Act produced one kind of underground. The Fugitive Slave Act and its aftermath produced another. The colonial suppression of indigenous culture and spatial knowledge produced a third. But the pattern is consistent. When the surface refuses to accommodate a community, the community finds the underground. That consistency is itself historically significant. It suggests that the underground of Canada is not an accident or a curiosity. It is a structural feature of a society that has, throughout its history, simultaneously depended on and excluded certain populations. The tunnels and passages and hidden spaces beneath Canadian cities are the physical record of that contradiction. They are the architecture of a society that said, in its laws and its customs and its violence, that certain people did not belong above ground, and the equally eloquent record of those people's refusal to disappear. The underground remembered everyone it sheltered. It kept no ledger and issued no receipt. But the earth is a reliable archivist in its own way, holding charcoal and ceramic and the altered chemistry of human habitation in layers that outlast the people who made them. When you walk over any Canadian city, you're walking over that archive. Most of it is inaccessible and much of it is damaged, but it is there, and it is saying something about this country that the official history has been slow to fully hear. The tunnels beneath Canada are not a mystery in the sense that the word usually implies. They are not inexplicable. They are, once you have the right framework and the right tools and the right willingness to listen to the people who built them and used them and remembered them in oral tradition across generations, perfectly explicable. They are the record of what happens when a society excludes certain communities from the surface, and those communities respond with the ingenuity and resilience that survival requires. The mystery, if there is one, is why it took so long to ask the right questions, and why, even now, and the answers have not been fully incorporated into the account Canada tells itself about what it built and who built it and what was done in the building. Those questions are still open. The ground is still full of answers, and the tools to find them, the radar and the geochemistry and the careful scholarship and the collaborative listening, are finally beginning to be adequate to the task. The map beneath the map is waiting to be drawn.